I want to welcome everybody to the next episode of Fridays at 5 by the Lightning Class. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Hugh Hutchison. I am the president of the Lightning Class this year. Unfortunately, with the schedule being what it is, I'm not going to have the opportunity to meet as many of you as I might like, but nonetheless, I hope there'll be opportunities to meet as many of you as possible over the upcoming period. Today, we are going to learn how to be the first person to make it to the first mark with a discussion of Upwind tactics and strategy brought to us by Nick Turney from Turney Sailing Services. We want to thank all of you in these trying circumstances for your continued support of the class. Even though much of the day-to-day events that are scheduled by the class and for the class have had to be put aside either temporarily or in many cases now permanently for this year. The class serves an important purpose and needs all of your continuing support. And so for those of you who have not renewed memberships to date, please do so. We are counting on that support. Your memberships are good for a year, that is for 12 months. Probably a month or so prior to the expiration, you will get an email reminder, and we'd appreciate it if you keep your membership current and renew on time. And certainly in addition to your individual memberships, fleet dues are due in January. If your fleet has not yet paid its current dues, or frankly, some are still delinquent from last year. So I appreciate if each of you would consult with whomever it is in your fleet that is responsible for paying the fleet dues and get the fleet dues paid this year. So among the events that you get the benefit of are Friday at 5. And so we will now dive into the substance of this program. I'd like to introduce our speaker. He's somebody who is well known, certainly to everybody who has attended the last several Southern Circuits, since he was the guiding light and source of all information in our Southern Circuit Mentor Program. Many of us benefited directly from his ongoing comments and observations. But our speaker is Nick Turney. If you were on the prior webinar that Nick did, you certainly are now familiar with him. But for those of you that don't know Nick and weren't part of the prior webinar, he is somebody who has vast sailing experience. He serves as a sailing coach and mentor in many classes, in addition to being somebody who does coaching and is available as part of his profession. His credentials include personally being world, North American, national midwinter champion in a number of classes. So he has the personal credentials to stand behind his comments. Nick created Turney Sailing Services a few years ago, and through that is anxious to make sure that all of us, all the sailors that he comes into contact, achieve their goals and enjoy our great sport. Let's just hope we can get back to it sooner rather than later. And with that, Nick, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Hugh, for that introduction, and thank you, Laura, for putting these together, and thank you, the Lightning Class, for your continued support and having me tonight. If you missed last week's seminar, it will be posted online here shortly for your viewing, and tonight's seminar will also get posted online for your viewing later. If you have any questions throughout the presentation tonight, use the chat box. I'll be monitoring that, and I will get to all your questions. And if questions come up down the road, just shoot me an email. That information will be provided at the end of the webinar tonight. And look forward to staying in touch with all you guys. So tonight, what we want to talk about is a little bit of upwind strategy and tactics, and some things that we want to achieve and learn about. And for some, this might be a review or a refresher course. Others might pick up some new tidbits here and there. But this is kind of my general practice of strategy and tactics, and I want to purvey that onto you guys. So first, we want to learn what goes into developing a strategy. So there's certain key and critical points that go into developing a strategy. Then next, we want to look at some tactical decisions that are made to help us implement our strategy. And those decisions are going to lead to being able to make better decisions on the water, but put a successful leg together. And then you put a successful leg together, you put 2 in a row, 3 in a row, and you have yourself a really good race. And that's what we were trying to strive for. So tonight we're going to focus just on that first leg. So from the start to the windward mark, and we'll continue from there. So we want to discuss the differences here between strategy and tactics. And there are some subtle differences, and it's really important to know what those differences are. So here in the blue box, by definition in the dictionary, strategy is a careful plan or method for achieving a goal, usually over a long period of time. Now, in our sailing Bible, the definition is gaining information about the sailing venue or the race course to use as an advantage in a race. By definition is the science and art of disposing and maneuvering forces in combat. In our sailing Bible, tactics is the actual physical position of your boat in relation to your competition to allow you to implement your strategy and gain an advantage. So digging in more into strategy, and later in the presentation, we're actually going to dig into strategy even more. It's a very critical part of a race. So strategy is your overall game plan for the race ahead. So questions you might ask yourself, where do I want to start and why? If you were in last week's seminar on starting, we talked a little bit about strategy on where you want to position yourself on a starting line. And now we're going to take that one step further, and we're going to look up the race course. And we're going to start based on what our strategy is, and we're going to look up the race course and continue to develop that strategy or pay attention to any changes as our strategy needs to evolve as the conditions change. Where do I want to go on the race course? So we'll talk about what's happening on the race course and if anything's changing and how it's in fact going to impact our strategy. And then it's really important to know that your strategy and game plan is always evolving as conditions change. So as you're in the pre-start and you're looking upwind and you're analyzing the conditions and you're trying to come up with a game plan or strategy, and you start the race and your strategy and your game plan was wrong or it falls apart. How many people have been there? I can see everyone's hands being raised right now. I've been there many, many times. So it's important to keep that in mind, is that your strategy and game plan needs to change. It's never going to be consistent. It's never going to be the same. Our sailing conditions are changing constantly. And we're going to talk about some things that might cause those changes and things that we need to pay attention to and look for on the race course. So here's what's involved in strategy. We want to look at the weather forecast for sure. And we also want to look at the current weather, what's happening on our race course at the moment. Is it true to the forecast or is it not true to the forecast, and why? How is the weather going to have an impact on our race course? Is it going to be a cloudy day? The clouds could be driving puffs, causing oscillating shifts. Is it going to be a clear day? Or is it going to be a sea breeze condition? And we want to look at all that stuff and analyze all that stuff so that we can develop our game plan for that leg. Breeze and wind trends, wind shifts. We're going to dig into more into wind shifts tonight also. But that's involved in strategy. Tide and current. We're not going to talk about tide and current a whole lot tonight, but it's definitely involved in strategy, and we want to pay attention to it. And we could have a whole nother webinar just based on tide and current and learn about that and how it affects your race course. And last thing that's involved in strategy is geographic features. I think we've all sailed in venues such as inland lakes. We've all sailed in St. Pete. We've all sailed in Miami. There's lots of geographic features that have an impact on our race course. And so all those are definitely involved in developing a strategy. We don't want to bypass that. We want to look at all that stuff, get the data from it, and then that'll help us develop our strategy. Tactics are the boat-on-boat decisions or race course management decisions that we need to make to implement our strategy and game plan. So tactics are more of these decisions that we have to make. And I saw a couple questions come in earlier on when you need to make these decisions or how you need to make these decisions. And when we start looking at the race course itself and the different sections of the race course, there's certain decisions that you have to make in different sections of the race course. And these are all the decisions that we need to make. So do I tack or do I duck? Do I lead a group or tack in front of a group and lead them? Or do I cross the pack? Stay in control? Do I cover the group that's behind me? Or do I create leverage to try to find a passing lane or make a gain? And the last thing is your risk versus reward decision. How risky do I need to be? And what's the award going to pay off? Or do I need to be more conservative and consolidate and be happy with where I'm at? Now, I know people have all been in situations and have all been on the water in the race and had to ask yourself these questions. What am I doing with this guy on port? Is he going to cross me? Is he going to tack to leeward of me? What am I going to do if he tacks to leeward of me? What am I going to do if he crosses me? If you're on port, do I tack or do I duck the starboard tack boats that are coming at me? We're going to look into all those decisions tonight and help you in this decision-making process. So as we dig into the steps of developing a strategy, and if you were in last week's webinar, we talked about establishing what type of day it is, and we're going to stick to that formula. I find that that formula kind of simplifies things, and it helps you really set the groundwork or a base for developing a strategy. Now, we looked at type of day for starting strategies and developing an approach for getting the boat off the starting line. Now we're going to look at the type of day for an upwind strategy. So what type of day is it? It's a light air day. So our priorities here are finding pressure, of course, that's obvious. Minimizing maneuvers is really important. You know, in light air, every time you get the boat up to speed and then you perform a maneuver, the boat slows down, then you have to get back up to target speed. So the more tacks we complete in a beat, the slower we're going to go. So we want to work on minimizing maneuvers. So as you develop a strategy and you're locating the pressure on the race course, you want to make sure that the pressure that you find or the pressure that you're going after is going to be consistent and it's going to be there for a long extended period of time. And then last here is avoiding traffic. So especially in light air where the breeze is really fragile and air moves up and over and around objects, and packs of boats don't absorb all that air. They lose all that energy. The air is going to go over them and around them. And if you're involved in that pack, you're definitely going to be slower than a boat sailing out on its own. So as we're developing a strategy and we're looking up the race course, we definitely want to make sure that we're avoiding those clumps or big traffic areas. Medium type of day, and I call this champagne sailing days. We've all been involved in these days. We all love these days. And these conditions offer a wide range of options. Medium air days could be puffy days, really shifty days, really fun to sail, or it could be a sea breeze day where the breeze is more persistent and stable. And in those conditions, it's all about lane management and attacking the race course. When I say attacking the race course, what I mean there is because it's medium air conditions and you have the ability to perform maneuvers without sacrificing too much boat speed. Now, the boat's going to be somewhat powered up. You can attack the race course. You can afford to do a couple tacks in that leg. And so you can be aggressive in playing those shifts. And we want to look at the race course as kind of a quadrant setup, and we'll talk more about that later. But in a medium air day, you can utilize more quadrants of the race course versus a light air day, or the last one here, a heavy air day, or overpowered conditions. And in overpowering conditions, especially with larger sea states, is we really want to minimize maneuvers. So tacks are expensive in light air and also in heavy air. and tacks become somewhat more difficult in heavier air. And we definitely lose a lot of boat speed in that maneuver. So minimizing those maneuvers is going to pay off in the long run. And when we talk about race course management, you'll see how to utilize that and how to minimize maneuvers and still attack the race course. Next point is sail the lifted tack as long as possible, or the long tack. And we talk more about tactics and strategy in a little bit. We're going to talk a lot about establishing or figuring out what that long tack is. And in heavy air conditions, it's really important to utilize that and stay on the long tack for as long as possible. Get up the race course and avoid the maneuvers. And also avoiding traffic. You know, again, packs of boats go slow in light air. And also, if you're around traffic, you're going to have to maneuver a little bit more. You can't quite focus on boat speed. You're going to be focusing on what the traffic around you is doing. And so it's important to find a lane or find an area on the race course that has less density or lower density so that you can focus on being on the long tack for as long as possible and avoiding traffic and minimizing those maneuvers. So after we've established what type of day it is, so lighter day, medium air day, heavier day, next step is we want to figure out what the wind shifts or wind phases are doing. And I'm sure we've all practiced this. We've all gone upwind before the start, and we get our compass headings, our high, medium, and low heading. And we all write those numbers down on the deck. You guys all do that, right? Everyone's raising their hand. So we're going to take that one step further. And this is kind of what a tactician's job is on our bigger boats. And I have a wet notepad in the photo here. And so what we want to do is we want to collect that data and we want to analyze it a little bit more. So we want to see how frequent these shifts are happening. In an oscillating condition, how quick are the oscillations happening and how aggressive are they? And then what is causing those oscillations? Is it cloud cover moving over the race course? Is it a weather system that's having an impact and pulling the gradient breeze one direction or the other? Are there geographic features causing the oscillations? As you get closer and closer to shoreline, the wind is bending or changing. We really want to pay attention and track how the shifts are happening, where they're happening, and how aggressive they are. And it's also important to, as the bottom photo here shows, determine if it's a persistent shift condition or an oscillating shift condition. Now, a little bit later in the slide, we're going to learn how to develop a strategy and use tactics or a couple tactical decisions in a persistent shift, and then what tactical decisions are need to be made in an oscillating shift and how you approach that race course and develop that strategy. So digging into the two different types of shifts here. And the first one we're going to talk about is persistent shifts. Persistent shifts are driven by wind lines or long extended veins of pressure. There can be usually a sea breeze condition, and we've all sailed in St. Pete and waiting for that beautiful sea breeze to fill in. And when that beautiful sea breeze fills in, it's not an oscillating shift, it's a persistent shift. And it still continues to move in a direction a little bit rather slowly, or if it's a weaker sea breeze, it moves in that direction rather quickly. Weather systems also provide persistent shifts. So an approaching weather system coming in can drive or pull the breeze one direction or the other. Also, a weather system that is passed and moving away from us will tend to create a persistent shift and swinging the breeze one direction or the other. But as we're developing a strategy and we want to look at or develop a game plan for our first beat or our first leg, it's really important to identify if we're in a persistent shift condition. How fast is that persistent shift moving, or how aggressive is it? And what is the timing of it, or what is the frequency of it? Is it 10 degrees every 30 minutes? Is it 10 degrees every 2 minutes? We have to figure that out. And the sooner we figure that out and we enter the race course and we're still seeing a persistent shift, and you think it's going to get weaker or stronger, you can utilize that information and position yourself on the race course to take advantage of that. So here's how we use persistent shifts in a tactical sense. So we definitely want to stay on the long tack. So a long tack meaning the lifted tack. So if it's a persistent left trend or a persistent left shift, and port tack is going to be the long tack or the favorite tack. So we want to put ourselves onto the race course or start in an area that allows us to get to port tack rather quickly. And we also want to protect that shift. So if we do get on the long tack, and we are on the long tack for as long as possible, there's going to be boats always getting to the left of us. And it's important to pay attention to that from a race course management sense. And when we look at the quadrants and a little bit later, in a persistent shift, if you're early in the race course, you need to protect the shift. So you need to dig back in and minimize how many boats are getting to the inside of that shift of you. If you're higher up in the race, so you're approaching the top third of the beat, the persistent shift isn't a big of a factor, and lane management takes over. So we don't really have to protect the shift at that point. So it really depends on where you're at on the race course. Good rule of thumb is stay between your competition and the mark. It's very true in persistent shift conditions. In oscillating conditions, staying between your competition and the mark, you generally lose. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit in oscillating shifts. So we've all been behind in races. Most of you guys are saying, no, I win every single race. Me too. When we're behind, we want to focus on getting up the course. So again, go back to rule number 1 here, stay on the long tack or utilize that long tack. That's going to get you up the course fastest. You're going to sail the less distance. So even though you're behind, you might be in a bad lane. You have to look at how big is the shift, and if you tack, how much distance are you losing up the course? Because if you're losing that distance, you're losing that distance to everybody else that's on the favorite tack. You're not just losing that distance to the boat around you. So keep in mind that if it's a rather big persistent shift, sailing in a mediocre lane, you're not going to lose as much as if you would be on the unfavored tack sailing away from the mark. Wind shifts, types of shifts. So here we're going to talk about oscillating shifts. So oscillating shifts are driven usually from clouds. And if you were at the Southern Circuit last year, we talked a lot about how clouds affect the race course. When we were in Miami, perfect condition and perfect venue for utilizing clouds for tactical and strategical reasons. So what puffs do, they come from clouds, they hit the water, and they fan out like a cat's paw. And those cause oscillating shifts. And depending on where you are at in that puff or where you approach that puff from is going to tell you what type of shift it is. But nonetheless, they're oscillating shifts. So the direction is always changing. Thermal puffs create oscillating shifts. So in heating or cooling conditions, you're going to have puffs coming from shore or being pulled into shore. And those are oscillating shifts. And then last, geographic features cause the wind to bend or change direction, and that's an oscillating shift. So westerly in St. Pete, coming from the city or coming over the land, the peninsula there, it's going to be rather shifty, and we've all seen that condition. And what's happening is those geographic features are bending and changing the wind's direction, and those puffs that finally make contact with the water are going to be a different direction depending where you're at on the race course. So it's important when you're developing your strategy to not only figure out what type of day is it, light air day, medium air day, heavy air day, and how you're going to approach the race course. Next, we want to figure out what the breeze is going to do and how it's going to impact our race course or that leg. Is it a persistent shift day or is it an oscillating shift day? So here's some tactical decisions in oscillating shifts. So in oscillating, you always want to lead the pack. So when I say lead, that means to tack to leeward and ahead of a boat or a pack of boats that's leading towards the next shift. So if you are headed and you have a pack of boats approaching from the other side or on the opposite tack, you can converge with that pack. As soon as you get to that same shift, you definitely want to tack to leeward and lead, because in an oscillating condition, the shift is going to change. Depending where you're at on the race course, you can set yourself up for a passing lane by leading. So we get close to the top third, we're not going to focus on shifts as much as lanes, and we'll talk more about that when we get to that diagram. Oscillating shifts, it's more important to stay in phase, but plan your tacks. So in light air conditions, we don't want to be maneuvering a whole lot. In heavier conditions, we don't want to be tacking a whole lot. So in an oscillating shift, when we do become headed, you have to make that decision. How big is the header? How long is the shift going to last? You can use the data that you collected in your pre-race. how long are the shifts lasting? And what is driving these puffs? If it's a short puff that's going to last maybe 10, 20, 30 seconds, a tack is pretty expensive. You might not want to take that shift. If you're in a position on the race course where you can utilize that quick shift to cross a pack of boats or regain a little bit of ground that you lost, consolidate, you more than willing or more than happy to do that, but you have to look at where you're at on the race course in relation to the other boats and plan those tacks or use those tacks carefully. The last is options. So in oscillating shifts, we have a lot of options. We're headed, do we tack or do we continue? We're lifted, we continue, but we're getting towards the edge of the course. We have to make decisions. And those decisions are when to tack or when to cross, or when to duck and continue. And those are all dependent on where you're at on the race course. And I promise I will make it as simple as possible when I show you this quadrant map and what decisions need to be made in certain areas on the race course. The last type of shift that we're going to deal with here is geographic shifts. And geographic shifts come from land features, such as buildings or the curvature of a landmass. And those land features or those buildings bend the breeze or change the wind direction. And they're usually always going to be there or always going to have an effect on the race course in that area. So we want to figure out, first we want to get to that geographic feature and figure out, is it on our race course? And then we want to figure out how it's affecting the true wind direction or how much of a shift is it causing. So in a geographic feature, from a tactical standpoint, you're racing your competitors to a spot or location on the race course. So your decision-making and your strategy and game plan, you have to figure out how you're going to beat your competitors to that location. So from a start, how am I going to get off the line and get to that left feature? If you have a bad start, how am I going to recover and get to that land feature so I can take advantage of that? Or is it even possible? Like the last point here, identify if you can even reach that geographic feature. So if you can't get to that geographic feature without, say, a persistent shift, sailing the long tack, if you're on the long tack and you're getting up the race course, and if you tack to try to get to a geographic feature, how much distance would you be losing? It's probably not worth it, so you can't realistically reach that geographic feature. But it's always important when you're developing a strategy to figure out if that is available, where is it, and can you get to it? So step 3 here in strategy is, what does the race course look like? So here we're going to talk about all the information given to us from the race committee, whether it's via VHF or course board on the back of a boat. We want to look at how they have the race course set up. So what is the course heading and direction? And then we're going to use our wind data that we've collected earlier on what is the true wind direction doing. Is it oscillating or is it persistent shift? What phase is the wind in currently? So by phase, I mean, if it's an oscillating shift, you could be in a right phase, and that right phase could be lasting for a minute or two. So where are you at in that phase cycle? And when at the end of the phase cycle, what happens? Does it go back to the course heading? Or does it go back left of the mark or course set heading? So we need to use that, get that information, collect that data, and then use that data to help us develop a strategy. So once we have our race course information, we know what the course is set to, we know what the true wind direction is doing, we need to identify what the long tack is. And that's the tack that you're going to sail the shortest distance to the mark. So think of it in a ley line situation here. And from the starting line and to reach port ley line, so if we continue straight, if the wind is in a right phase, like the diagram here shows, we want to sail on starboard because that's going to be the lifted tack. We're going to need to sail on starboard for 8 minutes before we reach a port ley line for the mark. Now, if we were to tack to port, how long would we need to sail before we reach the starboard tack ley line? Well, since the starboard tack lay line might be a little closer, you're not going to be able to, it's not going to take you as long to get there. So that would not be the long tack. The long tack is the tack that's going to get us up the course the fastest and sail the less distance. Lastly, in a race course setting, once we have our data, once we know where the wind direction is, where the course is set to, we're going to go back to our geographic feature point. And then we all sail in inland lakes. We all sail in venues that have geographic features. Talk through those features and will they have an impact or an effect on your race course? And how are you going to get there if it does? So here's my infamous thirds rule. And if you've had the pleasure of sitting in on any of my webinars earlier or attending the Southern Circuit, I know you've heard me talk about this. And so this is kind of how I like to simplify strategy and tactics, is I like to divide the race course up into quadrants. So here we have the top section of the starting line. We have the top section of the race course here, middle section of the race course in this entirety here, and the bottom section of the race course in this entirety here. And then we go to the left side of the race course, middle, and right side of the race course. So certain decisions need to be made in certain sections of the race course, like over here, or this section, and this section, and this section. So we're going to talk about, when we get into the tactics, what are those decisions that need to be made when I'm in a certain section of the race course. But you need to have race course awareness. You need to know where you're at on the race course. And one question that came in was, how can I help my skipper with strategy in developing a game plan? And as crew, what you can do is you can paint the picture. Say, okay, boss, we're on starboard tack here. We're just leaving the bottom third, and we're approaching the middle left section of the race course. Well, that paints a perfect picture so that your helmsman knows that you're approaching this section of the race course. Okay, so you're in this section of the race course. There's going to be certain decisions that need to be made in that section of the race course as you're converging with other boats and traffic, or you're analyzing wind shifts and wind phases. And we'll talk more about that in the tactics session. So the first third, so the bottom part of the race, or the very first part of the race, is we want to attack the first shift. So we've gotten all of our data. We know how fast these shifts are happening. We know the frequency of the shifts, so how many degrees the wind is changing direction. That's how we get ahead early. That's how we make early gains, and that's how the good guys get punched. They figure out what the phase is. They figure out how to use that phase in the first section. And then from there, they can attack the race course from being ahead. If you're behind, you're limited in what you can do based on lanes, being tacked on, being forced in certain directions. So if you can figure out what the first shift is going to be and how you can utilize that first shift to get ahead early, that's going to tell you what zone to start in. So say if it's a left shift or right shift, what zone should I start in? Well, if it's a left shift, you should start in the left zone so that you can utilize that shift. Hopefully boats around you tack and utilize that shift as well. If it's a right shift, you can start more towards the weather end of the line and you'll be inside that shift. In an oscillating condition, one could argue that if it's a left shift and I want to tack and get on the long tack right away, why don't I start near the weather end so that I can tack right away? And in oscillating conditions, if you know that a right shift is approaching in that first section of the race course, that would be a very good strategy or game plan. But the purpose of the first third and attacking the first shift is knowing where that first shift is going to be. If the left phase is dying, or you're at the end of that cycle, and the right phase is going to be next, you're going to want to start near the weather end to take advantage of that right phase. So in the first third, you need to establish what side you want to protect. So if you want to get left, you don't want to start at the weather end of the starting line. It's going to be hard for you to get left. You could, suffer a bad lane and get forced to tack. Now all of a sudden you're sailing towards the right side of the race course. If you start middle of the line or more down towards the pin, it's going to be a lot easier to sail straight and get left. Vice versa, if you want to get right, you're going to start near the weather end so that you can tack and you can go right. Don't put yourself in the middle of the course is where I'm getting at with this. So in the first section of the race course, you need to pick your side. So plan ahead, what's going to be the first shift? How long is that first shift going to last? And then what is the next phase going to be? So the next phase can be a right shift. Then in the first third, you want to set yourself up to get towards that right, middle right section of the race course. Middle section of the race course here. So we definitely want to avoid the middle. And we'll look at another diagram of the thirds rule in a second. But what happens in the middle of the race course, if you're in the middle of the group or if you're in the back of the fleet, is both edges are going to pass you. If you're towards the front of the fleet, it's not as risky, but if you have a group of boats splitting, one group of boats going left, the other pack of boats going right, you're going to lose to one of those packs. So you definitely want to avoid the middle and pick an edge. And you're going to pick that edge in the first third based on your wind data. What is the shift going to be when I approach that middle section of the race course? So in the middle section of the race course, as we get closer and closer towards the top third, is you need to make the decision to lead off that edge or cross and sail all the way to the edge. Those decisions need to be made in that middle section as you approach the top third. And we'll talk more about those decisions in the tactical section of this presentation. In the middle section of the race course, it's important to keep your options open in oscillating conditions. So when I say that, is you don't want to get to the edge too early. So if you're starting near the pin and you're sailing straight towards the left, you really need to focus on where the corner is. And in oscillating conditions, there's still going to be shifts happening. And if you're all the way out on the edge, you can't take advantage of those shifts. You're going to sail out of phase for a couple of them. So you're going to end up losing some distance and some ground there. So focus on where you're at on the race course. And if you're in the middle section and you're in an oscillation and you get headed and you have good oscillation and it's a good time to tack and consolidate and get more centered on the race course, not in the middle, but get more centered on the race course so that you can utilize a few more oscillations and take advantage of those gains. And the top third. So in the top third, we're not going to focus on wind shifts anymore. So in the top third, we've already established where we're at in the fleet. And here we need to focus on the ley line battles. So if you're ahead, consolidating and protecting that starboard tack ley line is going to be critical, or that should be your strategy or game plan. If you're behind, what are your options? Well, if you're behind, you need to focus on setting yourself up in a good, clean lane, because a lot of boats, as boats converge, there's going to be a lot of traffic and boats in groups and traffic goes slow. So how am I going to avoid the traffic? And when am I going to pick my spot on that starboard tack ley line? So in the top third, your decision making is based on that. It's not based on wind shifts. Traffic management. So when to protect starboard advantage. And as you approach the top third, starboard advantage becomes more and more critical. And so we need to look at what is the traffic around us, or where are the boats around us going? And how is that going to impact my decision on where I want to be on the race course in the top third? So if you have a lot of boats setting up on starboard tack ley line early as you approach that top third, and you want to use the rule of staying away from boats, so you're going to set yourself up more to the left of that group and more towards port ley line. Is port ley line an option? Well, if you have a lot of starboard tack boats setting up, port ley line is pretty risky. So then what you're doing is you're looking for gaps or holes or a lower density area on that starboard tack ley line and picking your spot or timing that spot. Got a question here. Never cross the rum line on a knock. Mark Bryant. Yep, that's a good one. That's a good point. Okay, on the race course, thirds will explain. So This is a slide that if I were you guys, I would print. And I always review this in my notes and coaching as well. So in the bottom third of the first third, I want to set myself up so I can implement my strategy. So I need to ask myself, do I want to continue? Do I want to sail on starboard and sail towards the left? Or do I want to tack pretty quickly and sail towards the right? So that in the bottom third, you're picking your side, basically. In the middle, you're working that edge, or you're working that side or that quadrant of our racecourse diagram. And hopefully you're winning that side. Your goal should be to win that side. If you're behind, you're looking to create a little leverage or at least maintain with that group on that side of the racecourse. But like I said, avoiding the middle section of that racecourse. And so if you're in the middle, both sides are going to get around you. Top third is your traffic and lane management section of the racecourse. So when and where is starboard tack ley line forming? Is it forming early? Then you need to start looking for your spot. Is it forming later? Then port ley line might be an option for you. And then last in the top third is your opportunity to cross the course. So again, in the next slide, I'll show you here. This kind of helps you figure out what decisions need to be made in certain areas of the race course. So let's start from the beginning. If I want to, I'm right here. If I want to start here, if I want to go towards the left side of the quadrant. So I'm going to start down here towards the pin. And I'm going to sail straight towards this left section of the race course, this section over here. Okay. If you start towards the middle of the line and you're getting into this section of the race course here, this is the time where you pick your edge. And this would be, you'd be either looking for a shift to tack and go back right, or if the shift isn't happening, but you know the next phase is going to be a right phase, you need to pick that early in the leg, and picking that right at that where the bottom third meets the middle section of the race course. Again, avoiding this big red X here in the middle. And if you do find yourself in that middle section of the race course, what's happening is you're going to have traffic on both edges here, and if you're in the middle, you're going to be out of phase for one of those shifts. So you're always going to get passed by boats no matter what if you find yourself in the middle of the course. Now, if you say you find yourself on the edge, but you picked the wrong edge, you have more traffic, more density over here, and they're in phase, you got to think, in this section of the race course, there's a lot of distance on the race course. So you need to figure out how to minimize or stick to that edge until you can get towards this section of the race course or this section of the race course. Because once you're up there, then it becomes traffic management and the shift isn't as important. And you see that the distance sailed to the mark is a lot less. So your losses are going to be a lot less. So don't freak out if you see the other side crushing you. Stick to your edge and wait till you get to that top third of the beat to cross and figure out where you're going to be with that group or that fleet. A lot of times you see people give up too soon and they see that the right side of the course is winning and they're over here and they just say bite the bullet and you sail a headed tack all of this distance to get back to the right side of the race course. That's a lot of distance lost. If you just stay in phase and pick your spots, pick those little shifts, pick your spots, and survive until you get to that top third of the beat, your chances or your options become a little less dependent on the shift and more dependent on the lane management. So then you can focus on avoiding the clumps of boats, finding a clean lane and approaching that starboard tack ley line, or finding a spot to pick that starboard tack ley line. So I have high risk areas on this diagram, and I'm going to clean the slide up. So high risk areas are the corners. And I say that because in an oscillating shift, if you get to the corner too soon, you have no options left. In a persistent shift, if you get to the corner too soon, one, you risk overstanding, or you risk being tacked on by any boat that can cross you. And your option then is to sail in a bad lane for a long extended period of time, or you have to tack out and sail even more distance, lose a lot of distance to the mark, and tack back and find a better lane. So high risk areas are definitely getting to the corner too soon. And we have to know where the corner is. So as a crew, you can paint that picture for your helmsman. What section of the race course am I in? Am I approaching the corner? If you're getting close to the edge of the race course, where I have lead or cross, that decision needs to be made in this section of the race course. If you're approaching the edge, you definitely want to lead and tack. So you're looking for an opportunity to lead or tack. If you're more in this section of the race course, you're probably looking for an opportunity to cross or even duck and continue on. And we'll talk, when we get to the tactics section, we'll talk more about making those tactical decisions to duck or tack or continue on. So going back to the first third or bottom part of the leg here, and I have this comment, looking for an opportunity to consolidate. If you start at the weather end and you tack right away and you find yourself in this section of the race course, or this quadrant, you're looking for an opportunity to consolidate and bring your distance sailed back towards more of this line right here. Now, these lines are kind of where I like to sail. I typically position myself either on that line there if I want like the left, or this line here if I like the right. So what that does, it allows me to keep my options open in the middle part of the race, and I'm set up better for the top section of the race as I get more towards the top third, and then I focus on my lane management more and not so much on the shift. So here's a checklist you guys can print off and keep on board. So to develop your strategy, we first want to look at what type of day it is. It's a light air day, a medium air day, or heavy air day. Get our compass headings. So do our wind data research. Figure out if it's oscillating or a persistent shift. How frequent are those shifts happening, or how long are they happening? Where's the breeze on the race course? So how is it affecting the race course? Are the breeze vanes or wind lines moving down the course? Are they cloud driven or more oscillating shift conditions? Are geographic features available on the race course? And how big of an impact do they have on the race course? And lastly, our race course info. So what is the compass heading to the windward mark? What was my true wind direction heading? Is it a skewed course? What's the long tack? How big of a factor is the long tack? If it's a 2 or 3 degree shift, both tacks could be considered equal. If it's a 5, 10, 15 degree shift, then one tack definitely becomes more favored over the other. So now we're going to start to transition into the tactics side of our presentation. And what we want to look, and when we get into the tactics side, is we're going to focus on the decision-making part of it. So I know we've all have heard tactics and strategy presentations before, and I like to think of tactics as the actual decision-making when boats are converging. And so what we want to do is look at our strategy. So what is my strategy? Where do I want to be? Where do I want to go? And has anything changed? So modify your strategy as you need to. The next, we're going to move into the tactics, or the decision-making part. So with tactics, first you want to establish where the passing lane is. And what I mean by that is if it's an oscillating condition, your passing lane is going to be leading a pack of boats back towards the center of the race course. You're not leading a pack of boats towards an edge in an oscillating condition, because you get to that edge, then your options are diminished. So where is the passing lane? Identifying where the passing lane is. In a persistent shift, the passing lanes are much more fewer. There's not a whole lot of passing lanes in a persistent shift. So you need to, in that sense, figure out how to get a clean lane. And the clean lane is going to be the passing lane. And then last, attacking when you're behind. And so when you're behind an oscillating shift, it's about creating leverage so that you can utilize that shift more and gain more distance or more ladder rungs on the group of boats that, say, are on the other side of the race course. So examples of tactics or utilizing these passing lanes and controlling situations is we have these tools of either tack or duck. We have to make that decision. I'm converging with a pack of boats. Do I tack before them, or do I duck them? Do I lead or do I cross? So leading means tacking ahead and to leeward. Crossing obviously means crossing ahead. Do I force or do I control? So as two boats are converging, and you're on starboard tack, do you force that port boat to tack? Or do you tack to leeward and stay in control? Or do you let them go and stay in control, say they're out of phase and you want to continue straight? We'll look more into that more as we dig into the tactic stuff. And lastly, examples are you on the tack? So are we behind? If we're behind, we're definitely on the attack. So how are we gonna make decisions to get us back involved in the race? So we'll dig more into that in a little bit. So here's my rules of thumb for sailing straight. And these are the, got a question. So Bill Mock here says, if I'm in the top 5 of 25 boat fleet, why would I not tack when I have been headed to the mean wind direction in an oscillating day, even if it takes me to the center of the course? So if we go back to that quadrant, and I'm going to skip back a few slides here and get back to a diagram. So if you are in the top 5 of the 25 boat fleet and you are in, say, approaching this section of the race course here, so we're on starboard tack and we're approaching this section of the race course here, and you get headed, and it would put you directly over this X. If you're in the top 5, that's okay, but you have to recognize if you need to come back to prevent a shift happening over here, or boats that are getting to the left of you, or if you know that the right is going to be coming in, it's okay to cross as long as you have control of those boats around you. So again, middle of the course, you give up leverage to both sides. And so when you give up that leverage to both sides, that's where it becomes high risk. As long as you tack and you're in the middle of the race course, but you commit to an edge, you still commit to going one way or the other, and controlling the pack of boats, or say those 20 boats that you're ahead, as long as you're in control of those 20 boats, crossing the middle of the course is fine. But if you're not in control of those 20 boats, or you're splitting with those 20 boats, then that's where it becomes a higher risk situation. So on the race course sailing straight, so these are decisions that or questions I ask myself when I want to continue sailing straight. So as boats are converging, I want to continue straight when I'm on the lifted tack or when I'm in phase. So if I'm on starboard tack and I have a port boat converging me, I'm going to let them cross. So it's okay to duck. We'll talk more about that in a second. You're on the favored tack for current reasons. So you're on the favored tack for current help or relief. You're getting a lee bow push, or you're getting pushed straight behind. The other tack is more nose into it for some reason, or geographic features. So you're either heading towards your geographic feature, or you're in your geographic feature and you don't want to leave it. And then lastly is position for the next shift. So I have this if you're behind in the group. And I say miss one to get one, or create leverage. So if you're in the lifted tack, you're in phase and you become headed, you have the option to tack because you're headed, but you're behind in the fleet. And we want to create a little bit more leverage because we know that the next shift coming is only a minute away and we have 3 minutes left in our beat. So you're going to create that distance, get to that shift, have a clearer lane, and be in phase. So miss one to get one is a good rule of thumb if you're behind. But you have to have confidence, and you have to know that that shift is closely approaching. So we're using our collected wind data that we got earlier and not sailing out of phase for too long, giving up too much distance. So here's a couple tactical decisions to be made if you want to continue. So you're on starboard tack. If you're on starboard tack and you want to continue, you let port boats cross you. It's okay to duck boats. You don't want to necessarily utilize your starboard advantage. Now, I've been involved in races. I've been in the middle pack, and everyone's kind of real aggressive, and you port tack is the favorite tack. I'm sorry, starboard tack would be the favorite tack, and I'm on starboard tack, and I have a port boat coming across. I will yell at them. I will wave them through, say cross, 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 because I don't want to tack. Now, you also see example the other way where port tack is lifted, and you have this guy on starboard tack, and he's yelling at you starboard, even though he's headed. and you're on port, you're in phase, and if he tacks to leeward of you, or if he lets you go, you still be in phase, but he wants to utilize his starboard tack advantage and make you tack, and that puts you out of phase. So you have to really paint the picture for yourself and figure out where you're at on the race course and how these other boats are going to affect. And if you're on starboard tack and you want to continue straight, let all the port tack boats cross you, because hopefully you're in phase and you're just gaining distance by doing that. You're on port tack and you want to continue straight. It's okay to duck boats, and there's two types of ducks here. There's the high duck, or tactical duck. So the high duck is when you're on port tack and you have a starboard tack boat approaching and you're unsure of what they're going to do. So if you start to bear away for the duck and you gain a lot of boat speed and they roll into attack and lee bow you, you're going to have to tack away anyway, because you're going to be in a bad lane because of them tacking and lee bowing you. What the high duck prevents is you can sail a little high, slow. So basically you pinch and sail a little slower. So the starboard tack boat is still sailing at full speed. So you change that conversion rate. So as boats are sailing and converging, wish I had a whiteboard, and you sail higher and slower, he's still going to sail faster. So the duck is a little less aggressive. But if he tacks to leeward, then you just roll into attack. So you didn't lose any distance by reaching off or committing to that low duck. Now, the low duck is where we gain a lot of speed. So low ducks are better for lower wind speed or lighter wind speed, where we don't want to slow the boat down that much. So here I'm on the race course and I want to tack soon. So these are some reasons why I would be looking to tack. The wind shifted, you become headed. That's a really good reason to tack. You're crossed or about to cross a tide or current line, or you're near a geographic feature. That's a pretty good reason to tack. Lane and course management reasons. So keeping your options open and planning ahead. So going back to our quadrant, I am in the left quadrant and I'm getting close to the edge. Well, I'm looking for a good reason to tack. So I want to tack and I'm on starboard tack. So we have port boats converging, I'm on starboard, and I want to tack. I'm going to lee bow that port boat. I'm not going to let them cross me. I will make them tack, and then I will tack and take their lane. So force them away. Pay attention to boats ducking you. So in this situation here, if you're on starboard and you're looking to tack soon, and a boat ducks you, at the next exchange, they're going to be a starboard tack boat that you're going to have to deal with. So if you're looking to tack or you want to tack, you don't want a whole lot of boats ducking you. So you would need to tack sooner rather than later. So if you see a pack of port boats converging and you want to tack, tacking sooner rather than later, or tacking to leeward and ahead of that pack is going to be the controlling position. As soon as those boats start to duck you, then you're giving them starboard advantage at the next exchange. You're on port tack and you want to tack. So obviously you lee bow any starboard tack boats that are coming close, but you want to make it tight. And you can only perform a lee bow if you're going to cross them to begin with. So if you can't cross them, a lee bow isn't going to work, because by the time you complete your tack, they're still going to be able to either sail over you and have control over you. So if you can cross, then a lee bow is going to stick. And you want to make that lee bow stick so that that starboard tack boat has to tack away. So then you have options to tack when you want to tack. You're not pinned by that starboard tack boat. Now, if you can't cross that starboard tack boat, and it would be a duck, tacking sooner rather than later is going to be a better option, so that you can still tack and duck later and avoid being pinned by that starboard tack boat. So you're on port tack and you want to tack. Take a peek over your shoulder and look at traffic or port tack traffic that you could be tacking into. So if you're on port tack and you tack to starboard, how many boats are going to potentially lee bow you and force you the other way? So if it's not going to happen for a minute or two, then the tack is good and you can perform that. If you tack to starboard and then 10 seconds later you're going to get lee bowed or tacked on, you want to rethink that tack and pick a better spot or position to perform that tack in. So how's the long-term effect, or what is the long-term effect going to be when you tack? So now we're going to talk about controlling positions on the race course. And if the wind is stable, or there's no shifts, the controlling position is obviously between you and your competition and the next mark. So putting yourself in between the competition and the next mark. And the windward boat has the advantage, or the boat between competition and the mark. But you also want to pay attention to boats crossing and ducking. So starboard tack, it definitely has controlling position over anything on the race course. So we're going to go back to our quadrants and being in control. If we're in the left quadrant in the middle section of the race course, and we have a lot of boats ducking us, those boats are going to be an issue, or those boats are regaining control by the time we get to the top third of the course. So planning ahead, where are all these boats going and what are they doing? If they're ducking you, they're going to have starboard advantage later. When am I going to reconverge with them? And where are they going to be an issue? You have to think about who's going to be in control and when on the race course. So course awareness, where are you on the race course? So passing lanes are hard to find in stable wind conditions because there's no shifts. So then your lane management becomes critical. And lanes are, you can find an open lane early on in the race because we have more race course. But as the race course converges and all the boats converge at the top of the beat, our lanes become few, far, and in between, harder to find. So we have to plan ahead and set ourselves up to manage those lanes better by the time we get to the top third. So looking at the boats around you, looking at the packs of boats, where are they going and where will they be by the time they get to that top third of the race course? Oscillating shifts. So what's the controlling position in an oscillating shift? So the controlling position is the lee bow of any boat, so leading towards the next shift. So if the right shift is the current shift or the current phase, and you're on port and you're converging with a pack of starboard tack boats, you want to tack to leeward and ahead. So you don't want to tack underneath them because then they're in control. You tack to leeward and ahead, so then in the next shift comes, you're crossing. Ducking is okay. So if you need to get to the next shift and it's on the other side of a pack of boats, leading isn't going to be your answer because then they're going to tack and be able to get to that shift before you. So these are the decisions, or when you need to make these decisions of tacking or ducking. Where's the next oscillating shift going to be coming from? Oscillating shifts, creating leverage is the controlling position. So the far apart, or the wider the rungs are, when the shift happens, the more the gain is or more the loss is. So it also reminds you to stay in touch with the fleet to help minimize your losses. So in oscillating conditions, if it's really shifty, we've all seen this happen on inland lakes, is you get one guy that goes way, way right, and that right phase comes in, and he's way ahead. He created a lot of leverage, but it could have went the wrong way. Left shift could have come in and he could have been hosed. So staying in touch with the fleet means your losses are a lot smaller. So if you do suffer a loss, it's not going to be that bad, and you can remake that up in a different shift. Got another question popped up. Isn't true control and tacking right in front covers both wind conditions? Isn't true control then tacking right in front? So sorry, Bob, don't quite understand the question there. So I think what you mean is controlling position in a lee bow or leading a fleet. Well, we'll just go back and kind of re-describe this or explain this. So in an oscillating condition, so the wind is shifting back and forth, leading towards the next shift is always going to be the controlling position. So what that means, tacking in front covers the lead bow and sailing on top. Yeah, if you're crossing a pack of boats, you're right, tacking in front of a group. If it lifts, you're in control of the boats behind. If it heads, you don't lose, you're still in control. If you cross and you tack above in the next shift, heads, you lose to the boats to leeward of you. If you duck and tack above, and the next shift heads, you lose to that pack. But what we're talking about is leading towards the next shift. So we know what the next shift is going to be. So say we're on starboard, and starboard tack is, or it's a right phase, current right phase, so starboard tack is lifted. If we tack to leeward and ahead, and it heads, you gain more because you have a little bit of leverage on that pack of boats that you tack to leeward and ahead of. If you tack in front of them, yes, you don't gain or you don't lose. So you're still in control for sure. That's a controlling position. But we also want to look at where we can make more gains as well. So there's a difference between controlling and also there's a good difference between gaining in that situation. Yes, you're right. Tacking ahead, you are playing control for sure. But we also want to set ourselves up, if we know that shift is coming, tacking to leeward and ahead gives you that opportunity to gain. So if you know the next shift, if you're approaching a pack of boats and you know the next shift is going to be a right shift, and there's a pack of boats on starboard, and it's okay to duck those guys to get to that shift, then you are controlling in that spot because you'll be in phase at the next exchange. So it's kind of all about managing the oscillations and knowing what the next oscillation is going to be. So creating leverage is good, but it's risky. So getting back to your point, Bill, is in a situation where if you lee bow or tack to leeward and ahead, you have a little bit of leverage. And if you were correct and the next phase heads, you gain. But you take the risk that you could be wrong. And if it lifts, then you lost that pack. So if you were unsure of what that shift is going to be, controlling position would be to be tack in front of that pack. And if it lifts, you're still in control. If it heads, you're still in control. But we didn't lose or gain anything in that situation. Persistent shifts, controlling position to the shift. So in a persistent left shift, the farthest left boat would be in control. Unless we look at our course diagram again. And if it's a persistent right shift, and say we're not winning the race. So we're top 10, but we got pack of boats ahead of us, and we got a bunch of boats behind us. And then a persistent shift, if we're in the middle quadrant, in the middle right quadrant, and we're approaching the edge, and you are the rightmost boat, and there's still boats ahead of you or potential threats to tack on you, we want to make sure that we're paying attention to that threat early so that we don't hit that edge too soon. So by the time you get to the top third, that's when we're looking at being on the edge. But in that middle quadrant or the middle section of the race, especially in persistent shifts, it doesn't always gain or doesn't always put that boat in control that is the farthest boat into the shift. At the top third, the farthest boat into the shift for sure is going to be the boat that's gaining. So if you're behind, establishing a safe ley line. So what that means, what I mean there is if you're behind a group of boats in a persistent shift, that say it's a persistent right shift, so starboard tack ley line is going to be rather large and long. We want to establish a safe ley line. So minimizing how many boats or threats can tack in front of us or on us, and avoiding that double tack out to clear your lane. So a safe ley line would mean overstanding slightly so that you avoid that risk or that threat, or paying attention to how many boats are on port that would cross me and tack in front of me. If you're ahead, you're looking at protecting the ley line and starboard advantage. So if you're ahead, you're looking to nail the ley line. So no extra distance sail, and you don't have any threats or anyone tacking on you. You definitely don't want to overstand to extra distance sailed. And understanding the mark could be a threat if the shift continues right, and then you're going to have traffic or boats to the right of you to deal with. So coming into our last couple slides here, and if there's any other questions, please fire away. Bill, I hope I covered kind of what you're trying to say there. And defining what the controlling position was versus a position to make a little bit of a gain or leverage. And So here is another review of the quadrant picture, quadrant setup here. And I find this useful. And if you want to print this off and keep it on the boat, it might be a good idea. But here, we'll start from the beginning. We'll start in the first quadrant, and we'll kind of work our way up. And so if we know we want to go left, we're going to start in the left quadrant or the left half of the line. And then we're going to pay attention to how far left are we getting. If we're getting into this area here, you're looking for an opportunity to consolidate and get back towards this position here. Now, if you're in this position here and you look over your hip and you can cross everybody, it's okay to continue on as long as you still can tack and cross. But then we have to be very cautious of if there are any threats. If I get all the way out to the corner, is there going to be any threats of boats being able to make gains on me from the other side and potentially tacking on me and forcing me even further off the race course? So always asking yourself that question, where are you at on the race course? And what is the threat of me being here? And how close to the corner am I getting? And once we approach this section of the race course, we're looking at either leading the group back towards the center or crossing the pack and staying in control depending on what the shift is. And if it's a persistent shift, persistent left shift, you definitely want to cross the pack and tack above. That's going to be the controlling position. If you know the right shift is going to come in the top third, you can either, what Bill and I were discussing is either tacking to leeward of the group so that when you get that right shift, you get a little bit of a gain, or if you're just focusing on staying in control, tacking in front of the pack and leading. Now, say, to argue what Bill was saying a little bit, is if you can't cross that group, so you can't get to that controlled position of tacking in front of the group, then the lead is where you want to be. You don't want to duck half of them and then cross half of them, because then you're just going to lose to the boats that you ducked, and you might be still in control of the boats that you crossed, but then you got lane issues to worry about. So if you know that the right shift is coming and you're looking at making a decision here, you're on starboard and you need to make a decision on what you need to do, look over your shoulder, not a whole lot of traffic, you can lead this group and you'll have starboard advantage at the next exchange with them. And this is only if you weren't crossing. You'll have starboard advantage at the next exchange with them, and you set yourself up better for the top of the beat. When do we use boats on the hip are higher or lower, same speed? Yep, so that's a good reference, so relatives. That kind of goes into a boat speed or moding thing. So talking about boats on your hip, if boats are higher, lower, or same speed. And that can also go and help you establish what the shift is. So if boats are closer to you and the boat is higher or lower, same speed, that's probably a sail trim setup balance thing. If you're looking at boats farther away or on an edge, and so say we're going to use an example of a right shift. So current shift or current phase is right, and you have a pack of boats on your right hip, or your starboard hip, windward hip, sailing upwind, and those boats start to bow down or they're lower. What that means is that right phase is collapsed. So then you're going to look for the lefty to come, and then you can tack and take advantage of that shift. Now, if they're lifted or they're higher on your hip, that means that the right phase is holding or it's going to continue going right. So you have to wait for that, whatever pressure that they're in, to come down and hopefully greet you. Or in an oscillating condition, you might not be able to utilize that puff. That puff might go behind you. You might not be able to get it. So then you're just looking for an opportunity for them to come back even. If they're bow even, you can still tack, because that means you're not going to be tacking into a header. If they're bow down, it's a good chance or good opportunity to tack and consolidate and make gains. I hope that answered your question. So when you're looking at making that decision, if you are in this section of the race course here, and everyone's on port tack, okay, so you let a group of boats tacked underneath a group of boats, and they are bowed down to you. So they're aimed at your transom a little bit. This would be a good opportunity to consolidate and get back into that controlling position. So either cross and tack in front of them, or cross all the way through and tack above and to windward of them. But that puts yourself more in that quadrant and less in the middle of the race course. Next thing, so we'll reverse that, is if we're in this section of the race course and we're all on port, and we're this guy here, and we look over our hip and they're lifted or they're sailing higher than us. What we want to do is analyze the situation, say, okay, what pressure are they in? And will I be able to greet that pressure? And if you are, then be patient and wait for that shift to come. If you're not in that pressure and you're not going to get it, then you might have to ask yourself, do I tack and try to get to that pressure, or is that an option? And in most cases, you probably would tack to get to that pressure to at least minimize the loss from that shift. Because what's going to happen is you're going to end up, where'd my mouse go? If you wait too long and these guys are still lifted and it's a persistent lefty, and you never get that, then you're just losing and losing and losing. So have your crew look around, pay attention. How long is that pressure going to be there? If it's going to be there for a while, is it moving? Is it going to get to us? And if it's not going to get to you, then you have to attack that race course and get to that pressure a little bit more. But it's a good observation to know, if you can't identify what the shift is by looking at the puff on the water, you can look at the angle of the other boats. And that's what you're looking at by looking at boats on your hip, if they're lifted on you, if they're heading or lower than you. So a question from Wayne here: as a crew person, how can I contribute before and after the start? So before the start, what you can contribute is, as we talk about the wind data, so where do we see the most pressure on the race course? What is causing the pressure? Is the puffs coming from clouds, or is the puff coming from a sea breeze condition? Maybe it's sea breeze conditions are more persistent shifts. Are they streaky, wind veiny type lines? Or are they short, aggressive, geographic feature driven puffs? So once you identify that, you can help your skipper translate or figure out what the shifts are going to be when you're on the race course. So if you know that puffs are coming from clouds, and when the clouds come over, that pulls the breeze right, so that puff is going to be a righty, then once you're on the race course, you can paint the picture to your helmsman and say, okay, we're in this section of the race course over here. I see a puff coming here. I think it's going to be a righty based on our data. So once we get to that, we'll tack and we'll get back towards our middle third of or where we want to be on the race course. So race course awareness and helping paint the picture of where you're at. Another thing that good crews do is communicate on other boats on the race course. So going back to Bob Bush's question on angles, communicate that. Okay, we have a pack of boats on our hip, same tack, and they're lifted. Okay, that either means a shift is coming, or that means we have to tack and get into that shift. Or vice versa, we have a pack of boats on our hip and they're headed. Okay, where are we at on the race course? Okay, this is a good opportunity to consolidate and take advantage of that shift. Also, boats that are converging with you. If you're on port tack and you have a couple starboard tack boats, you have to communicate on those boats. How many boats are there if you had to duck? Or if they're crossing you, no duck, communicate that. And also make the decision. Like I said, tactical decisions need to be made when boats are converging. All tactical decisions need to be made when boats are converging. And so if you're on port and you have starboard tack boats, you have a couple decisions to make. I can either tack early, leeward in ahead, and lead. I can cross if I'm crossing. If you're not crossing, either lee bow or duck. So those are all decisions you have to be made, and then those decisions are based on where you're at on the race course. Yeah, thanks, Ralph. Yep, a lot of information was given tonight, and I'm sure it's a lot to absorb, like you said, And as you rewatch this video and questions come up, please don't hesitate to email me or give me a call even. I'd be happy to chat with you and go through them. So that's going to be it for tonight. We went through that rather quickly, and if you have any questions, we'll leave the chat box open for a little bit longer here. And also, so as questions pop up, and here's my email address. Please feel free to send me an email and ask your question or any comments or concerns or whatever. If you just want to get together and chat about sailing, I'm more than happy to do that as well. But I want to thank Laura and Hugh for having me on here tonight.